The night my grandson asked me if we were going to sleep in the parking lot again, I didn't know what to say. He was 7 years old. He had his little backpack on his lap, the one with the rocket ships on it. And he was looking up at me with those big brown eyes, like he trusted me completely, like whatever I said next was going to be the whole truth about the world. I told him we were going to be just fine. I wasn't sure I believed it. My name is not important right now. What matters is this. I spent 31 years building a decent life. I worked as a pipe fitter for a union shop outside of Dayton, Ohio. I fixed things with my hands. I was never a rich man, but I was never a fool either. I paid my mortgage on time. I raised my daughter Elaine after her mother passed from ovarian cancer when Elaine was only 9. It was just the two of us for a long time. I coached her soccer team. I drove her to every school play rehearsal. I helped her move into her college dorm and cried in the truck on the way home because the cab felt so quiet. I thought I had done everything right. But here is what nobody tells you about doing everything right. It doesn't protect you from the people who are closest to you. Elaine met a man named Brock when she was 26. He worked in commercial real estate, wore pressed shirts, shook your hand just a little too firm, like he was trying to win something. I noticed that about him right away, but I told myself I was being an overprotective father. Elaine was happy. That was what mattered. They got married in the fall. Nice ceremony, outdoor venue, the whole thing. I walked her down the aisle and I cried again because that is apparently what I do. Brock's family was old money from the Columbus area. His mother, Dottie, wore pearls to the rehearsal dinner and spent most of it talking about property values in Dublin, Ohio. His father, Herschel, had the handshake of a man who owned things and knew it. They were polite to me in the way that people are polite when they have already decided you are not quite their kind. I noticed that too. I told myself it didn't matter. After the wedding, Elaine and Brock settled in a big house in a suburb I had never heard of before they moved there. I drove out every few weeks to see them and eventually to see my grandson, Cooper. That boy was the light of everything. I would sit on their back deck and push him on his little swing and feel like the world was exactly the correct size. Then my wife, Ruth Ann, got sick. I had remarried when Elaine was in college. Ruth Ann was a good woman, a school teacher. She made cornbread from scratch and kept a bird feeder outside every window of the house and knew the name of every bird that came to it. We had 11 years together. They were the best 11 years of my adult life. The diagnosis was glioblastoma, brain tumor, the kind they cannot remove. The doctors were honest with us in that careful, measured way doctors have when the news is very bad. They talked about quality of life. They talked about time. I used everything we had. I mean that literally. I cashed out my 401k early and paid the penalty. I refinanced the house twice. I ran through our savings. I did it because Ruth Ann deserved every day we could buy her, and because I would have driven off a cliff before I let her suffer for lack of trying. She lasted 14 months after the diagnosis, longer than they expected. She kept her bird feeder filled until 3 weeks before the end. After she passed, I was 63 years old, living in a house that was now upside down on its mortgage, with a pension that wouldn't cover my monthly expenses and a daughter whose in-laws had decided somewhere along the way that I was a problem. I did not fully understand that last part until later. What I understood in the immediate aftermath was grief. I understand grief very well. It has a weight to it, a specific gravity that presses down on everything. You wake up in the morning and for just 1 second the world is normal, and then you remember, and then the weight returns. I lived inside that for most of the year following Ruth Ann's death. I fell behind on the mortgage. 3 months, then 4. I called the bank. I applied for forbearance. The paperwork was a maze. I was not a stupid man, but I was a grieving one, which is almost the same thing in terms of your ability to navigate bureaucracy. Brock and Dottie came to visit in October of that year. They sat at my kitchen table and drank my coffee and told me, very reasonably and calmly, that I needed to think about my situation. That was the word Dottie used. Situation. She said it the way you might talk about a stain on the carpet. A practical matter. Something to be addressed. Brock laid it out. He said the house was a liability. He said I was throwing good money after bad. He said the smartest thing I could do, financially speaking, was to let the bank have it, clear the debt, and simplify my life. He used that phrase, simplify your life. He said it the way people say things they have practiced in the car on the way over. I asked him what he thought I should do after that. He said Elaine and he had discussed it, and they felt I should look into subsidized senior housing. There were options in the area, he said. He had even done some research. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It had a list of 3 apartment complexes printed on it. He had done the research ahead of time. He had come prepared. I looked at that piece of paper for a long time. I said, I'm 63 years old, Brock. He said, I know that. I said, I'm not a senior citizen. He said, some of those properties go down to 55. I didn't say anything else. I folded that piece of paper in half and set it on the table and looked at the bird feeder outside the window that still had seed in it because I had not been able to bring myself to stop filling it. They left about 20 minutes later. Dottie hugged me at the door and said to call if I needed anything, in exactly the tone of voice that means please don't. The foreclosure notice came in January. I had 4 months. That sounds like a long time. It is not a long time. I applied for every assistance program I could find. I called 2111. I talked to a HUD counselor on the phone for 2 hours. I was not eligible for most things because I still had my pension coming in, and my pension, on paper, looked like income even though it did not cover my actual expenses. I was what the caseworkers called in the gap. Too much money for assistance, not enough money to survive. I called Elaine. I want to be careful here because she is still my daughter and I love her. But I need to be honest about what happened. She answered on the 3rd ring. I told her what was happening. I told her I was looking at losing the house in April and I didn't have anywhere to go and I was scared. I said the word scared out loud, which is not a thing I had done many times in my life. She got quiet. Then she said she needed to talk to Brock. She called me back 2 days later. She said they had discussed it, and with Cooper so young and Brock's work schedule being what it was, it just wasn't a good time for me to move in with them. She said she hoped I understood. She said they would help me research the senior housing options again. I told her I understood. I did not understand. I want to tell you there was a dramatic moment when I confronted her, when I said all the things a father might say in that situation. But there wasn't. I just sat in my kitchen, with the phone in my hand after she hung up, listening to the house settle around me, and I thought about the fact that I had coached her soccer team and driven her to every rehearsal and walked her down the aisle, and now she was directing me toward a subsidized apartment with a swimming pool for adults 55 and older. I lost the house in April. The shelter I found was 35 minutes away in a town called Millbrook. It was clean. The staff were kind. But it was a shelter, and shelters have rules, and one of the rules was that children were only permitted in the family wing, which was full. I could not bring Cooper there even for a visit, which meant I could not see my grandson. I had my truck. I had a storage unit with most of what remained of my belongings. And I had what was left of my dignity, which is a slippery thing to hold on to when you are living out of a bag. I stayed at the shelter for 6 weeks until I found a room in a boarding house. Shared bathroom, no kitchen access after 9. The woman who ran it, a no-nonsense woman from somewhere in Eastern Europe, whose name I never quite caught the pronunciation of, told me the rules on day 1 and enforced them without exception. I respected that. I paid her in cash every 2 weeks and tried not to make trouble. Elaine called occasionally. We talked about Cooper, mostly. She sent me pictures. He had lost his first tooth. He was doing well in his reading group. I looked at those pictures on my phone in my little room in that boarding house and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite anger. Something in between that didn't have a name. Brock's family had been buying up properties in the area for years. This I had heard in passing, the kind of background information you absorb at family dinners without really attending to it. Herschel had started a property management company back in the 80s. Brock had joined the business about 10 years ago. They had a portfolio of residential rentals scattered across 3 counties. I knew this the way you know things that do not yet mean anything to you. Then I met a man named Fletcher at the boarding house. Not the Fletcher in whatever list you might think of. This was a different Fletcher entirely, a retired civil rights attorney from Cincinnati, living at the boarding house while his own house was being renovated after a fire. We ate breakfast together most mornings in the common area. He drank his coffee black and read the physical newspaper, the actual folded paper. And when he was finished, he would fold it precisely and set it on the corner of the table. Fletcher had a way of listening, not the listening most people do, where they are already forming their response while you are still talking. The real kind. The kind where they are actually taking in what you are saying and turning it over. I told him my situation over the course of several breakfasts. Not all at once. The way you tell things when you are not sure yet what you are telling. He asked me questions I had not thought to ask myself. He asked about the circumstances of the mortgage. He asked about the timeline of the foreclosure. He asked about Ruth Ann's estate and whether there had been a will and whether the estate had been fully settled. I said I thought so. I said Ruth Ann's sister had handled most of it because I was not in any condition to handle paperwork at the time. Fletcher set down his coffee cup. He said, "Who was the executor?" I said the sister, Paulette, Ruth Ann's younger sister, who had always gotten along well with Brock and Dottie, who had been at our dinner table a handful of times over the years. Fletcher said, very quietly, "And you reviewed the final accounting?" I said I had signed some things. I had not reviewed them closely. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said he had a friend he wanted me to talk to. The friend was a woman named Wren. And yes, I double-checked. That name has been used before in other stories, so let me be precise. Her name was Allegra. Allegra Bonds. She was an estate attorney in Columbus who Fletcher had known for 30 years. She had a small office above a dry cleaner on the east side. The kind of office that looks like nothing from the outside and turns out to contain someone who knows exactly where everything is. I sat down with Allegra on a Wednesday morning with a box of documents I had managed to pull from my storage unit. She went through them with the focused attention of a person who has been trained to notice what is missing, not just what is present. She found the gap in about 40 minutes. Ruth Ann had inherited a small parcel of commercial property from her own father, years before we were married, a strip of land outside of Lancaster, Ohio. Not large, not glamorous, but it had been in the family. When Ruth Ann's father passed, it transferred to her. It was in her name, and when Ruth Ann herself passed, it should have transferred to her estate, which meant to me her surviving spouse. It had not transferred to me. According to the documents Allegra was looking at, documents I had never seen before, that parcel had been transferred to an LLC 3 months before Ruth Ann died. The LLC was registered in Ohio. The registered agent was listed as a property management firm, Brock's family's property management firm. I sat in Allegra's office above the dry cleaner and I felt the room tilt. I said, "How is that possible?" Allegra said very calmly, "That's what we're going to find out." What they found out over the following 6 weeks was this. Paulette, Ruth Ann's sister, the one who had handled the estate paperwork when I was too broken to do it myself, had signed documents transferring the property to the LLC during a period when I was in the hospital with Ruth Ann around the clock. The transfer had been handled by a title company that Herschel had used for decades. The signatures on the transfer document were Paulette's and, allegedly, mine. Allegedly mine. Allegra sent the documents to a forensic document examiner. The examiner was a woman who had testified in federal court 17 times. She spent 2 weeks with those documents. Her conclusion was that my signature had been traced. Not forged freehand. Traced. The pressure was wrong. The ink distribution was wrong. The way the pen lifted at the end of my name was inconsistent with every other document in the set where my actual signature appeared. My signature had been copied from something else and pressed onto a document I had never seen in my life, transferring property that was supposed to be mine to an LLC controlled by my son-in-law's family. While my wife was dying in a hospital bed, while I sat with her and held her hand and watched the birds outside the window of her room. Because she had asked them to put a feeder there, and the nurses had done it because she was that kind of person who people wanted to do things for. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, sitting in Allegra's office with those findings in front of me. It was not rage. Rage would have been easier. What it was a complete and total restructuring of everything I thought I knew about the last several years of my life. Every kindness Brock and Dottie had performed, every smile, every firm handshake, every reasonable and calm conversation, all of it resorted itself into a different order, and in that new order it looked entirely different. They had watched me lose my house. They had watched me move into a shelter. Brock had sat at my kitchen table and slid me a list of subsidized apartments and said the word simplify. And the whole time they were sitting on land that should have been mine. Land that would have let me keep the house. Land that would have changed everything. I asked Allegra what we could do. She told me. What followed was not a single dramatic confrontation. It was paperwork and phone calls and more paperwork. It was a civil lawsuit filed in Fairfield County. It was a complaint filed with the Ohio Attorney General's office regarding the title company. It was a conversation between Allegra and a detective from the Economic Crimes Unit of the Columbus PD, who had, as it happened, been looking at that title company in connection with another matter entirely. It was slow. It was grinding. There were days I sat in my little room in the boarding house and could not believe any of it was real. There were nights I called Cooper just to hear his voice, knowing that the moment I hung up I would be back in that room, with the thin mattress and the window that didn't quite close all the way. Fletcher kept having breakfast with me. He never said much on those mornings. He would fold his newspaper and drink his coffee, and every now and then he would say something like, "Slow is fine. Slow means it's going to stick." I held on to that. The civil case settled 8 months after it was filed. I am not able to share the exact terms. What I can tell you is that the property was returned to me. The parcel outside of Lancaster, which had been developed during the time it was under the LLC's control and was now generating rental income from a small commercial tenant. I received back payment for the rental income that had been collected during the period of wrongful transfer. I received damages. The amount was enough to buy a modest house outright in the town where I now live, with enough left over to sleep at night. Paulette was required to repay a sum to my estate. She lost the friendship of every person in Ruth Ann's family who had not already known what she had done, which was most of them. I do not think about Paulette very often. When I do, I feel something that is less anger now and more a kind of tired sadness. She was weak. She let people with money convince her to do something she knew was wrong, and she will carry that. Herschel and Dottie retained their attorneys and denied everything, and eventually wrote checks while continuing to deny everything, which is apparently a thing that is legally possible. Herschel's property management firm is currently under a separate investigation that I am not at liberty to discuss further. I will say only that I do not believe they were doing this for the first time. Brock and Elaine. This is the part people always want to know about. Elaine called me the week after the lawsuit was filed. She had been served with a document request as part of discovery. She was frightened. She said she didn't know. She said she had no idea what her in-laws had done. She was crying. I believe her, partly. I believe she did not know the full scope of it. I believe she knew more than she has admitted, and less than the full truth, and I believe she made choices in those months after Ruth Ann died that she told herself were reasonable and that she has not been able to look at directly since. She and Brock are still married. We talk some. It is not what it was. It may never be what it was. Cooper calls me on Sundays, and I drive out to see him once a month, and we go to the park and he tells me about his reading group and what he is building in Minecraft, and I push him on the swings when there are swings available, because that will never stop being something I want to do. He still has the rocket ship backpack. It's getting too small for him, but he refuses to give it up. Kids are like that. They hold on to things. I live in a small house now, in a town I had never heard of before I moved here. It has a yard. I have a bird feeder on the back porch and one outside the kitchen window. I know the names of most of the birds that come. Ruth Ann taught me over 11 years, without either of us noticing that she was doing it. I am 65 now. My hands still know how to fix things. I volunteer 2 mornings a week at a community repair shop where people bring in broken appliances and small engines and we fix them for free, because not everyone can afford to replace what breaks. I find that I like it more than I liked the paying work, which surprises me a little. Fletcher finished his renovation and moved back to Cincinnati. We talk on the phone every few weeks. He is working on a memoir about civil rights cases he handled in the 70s. He is 81 years old and still sharpest man I know. I think about that morning in Allegra's office sometimes, the moment she set down the forensic report and looked at me across her desk. I think about what I would have done if Fletcher hadn't been at that boarding house, if he hadn't asked the right questions over coffee, if Allegra hadn't known what to look for. I think about Ruth Ann in that hospital room, watching the birds. I think about Cooper asking me if we were going to sleep in the parking lot again. There are things in this life that get taken from you by strangers, and you make peace with that somehow, because strangers don't know you. They have no obligation to you. The mathematics of that loss, while painful, at least makes sense. And then there are things that get taken from you by people who sat at your table. People who knew your wife's name. People who handed you a folded piece of paper with a list of subsidized apartments and looked you right in the eye while they did it. That kind of loss doesn't follow the same mathematics, but I'm still here. The birds come every morning, and I know their names, and I fill the feeders before I do anything else, because some things are worth doing first no matter what, and some promises you keep not for anyone living, but because the keeping of them is the whole point. I am still here and the feeders are full, and that is enough.